Berlin, June 30th, 1933. Spartacus Olsson reporting from the German capital. The summer has arrived, and a sense of calm and order has settled over Germany. In the towns and villages, life goes on as usual. To most, it seems that the Nazi Revolution has passed without much of a fuss, and that the unruly years of the Weimar Republic are over. But hiding under that veneer of normalcy, the Nazi Revolution continued in the second quarter as they seized control of the judicial and violently eliminated any remaining political resistance to instigate a reign of systematic terror. Tonight, we go under the surface to uncover the real Germany and try to see if most Germans are choosing to live in an alternate reality, or perhaps even welcome the terror that seems to at least calm the streets. From April to June 1933, while the war between Japan and China over Manchuria ended with a truce, the famine in the USSR worsened, US President Roosevelt was inaugurated, and the world was busy looking for systematic cures to the still raging Great Depression. In Germany, the Nazis used their newly gained dictatorial power to tighten their control over the German Reich. The first public use of that power came already on Saturday, April 1st, 1933, with a nationwide state-organized attack on the Jewish community, the Boycott Day. Orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, Deinhard stood before Jewish-owned stores, banks, medical practices, law firms, and notary offices with the doors smeared with Jew, while the public was once again told that world Jewry was the architect of Germany's misery. The boycott did not create the spontaneous outpouring of violence against Germany's Jewish population that the Nazis had hoped for. But when Jewish businesses opened again on April 3rd, something was different. The boycott has cemented the idea that the small portion of ordinary Germans, less than 2%, who happen to be Jewish or come from Jewish origins, are different, that they are them, not us. It gave them pariah status. It has driven a wedge between neighbors who have lived next door for generations, speak the same language, look the same, have the same nationality, who are in fact identical in most aspects of life and, disregarding latent prejudices, only days ago thought of each other as nothing else than just neighbors. Goebbels hailed it as an imposing spectacle and mused at how calmly it all passed, and then went on to say that only we still have a hard struggle against the bureaucracy ahead of us. The wedge the boycott began to drive also paved the way for one of the steps in that struggle when, on April 7th, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed, introducing the Aryan paragraph to purge Jews and political unreliables from all government, judicial, and educational posts. This legal offensive continued on April 22nd and 25th with decrees restricting Jewish doctors and what is being euphemistically called overcrowding in schools. Meanwhile, if there was ever any doubt that the German National Socialist Workers' Party is neither socialist nor for the workers, such doubts were eradicated in May when the regime targeted the very backbone of the German left, organized labor. On May 1st, the Nazis co-opted the traditional working-class holiday, declaring it a holiday of national labor. The mask fell the following morning when SA and SS units raided trade union offices across the Reich, arresting leaders and seizing all assets. These unions were forcibly incorporated into the German Labor Front, DAF, on May 10th, an organization designed to regulate and survey the workforce, effectively eliminating workers' tools for collective bargaining, workplace influence, and the right to strike. With the unions and worker protections gone, the public is being told of a socialism of the deed, while we have it on firm sources that the regime has guaranteed big business liberal opportunities to reap profits and increase self-governing power over wages and their workforces in exchange for political cooperation. That same evening, May 10th, on the Berlin Opernplatz and in 34 other university towns, flames rose to the sky as enthusiastic Nazi students and SA-men torched mounds of books considered un-German, immoral, or detrimental to the national spirit. As Goebbels addressed the cheering crowds, the works of Albert Einstein, Erich Maria Remarque, H.G. Wells, Heinrich Mann, Karl Marx, Ernst Hemingway, Victor Hugo, Sigmund Freud, and many more were reduced to ash, symbolizing the decontamination of public life. Screamed Goebbels. The age of extreme intellectualism is over. The past is lying in flames. The future will rise from the flames within our hearts. The political purge culminated on June 22nd with the official banning of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, as subversive. By the end of the month, the Conservative and Centre parties began their self-dissolution. By today, June 30th, 1933, the total state is a legal reality. With that, the last potential bulwark against Nazi power abuse are gone. The events of this quarter had an especially deep effect on the justice system. With Jewish lawyers purged, even violently blocked from entering courthouses, the Nazis proceeded to replace judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and law clerks with Nazi jurists, and pressure the remaining legal professionals to enter the front line of Adolf Hitler's ranks and join the Federation of National Socialist Jurists, BNSDJ. By the end of May, the National Federation of German Judges had submitted entirely to the Nazi leadership, declaring its willingness to help in the revision of German law. Special courts are now in operation to handle political opposition. These courts have eliminated the jury system and the right to appeal. These courts are to prosecute treacherous attacks on the government, where the definition of treason has been broadened to include even private criticism of the movement and its leader. To enforce the new order, in April, the Prussian secret police was elevated to a federal institution, renamed the Geheime Staatspolizei, Gestapo, and given unrestricted powers of search, confiscation, and arrest. Anyone politically active in the Weimar years is now subject to protective custody in a concentration camp without trial or judicial review. With protective custody, the Nazis do not mean to shield the victim from the mob, but to imprison them indefinitely to protect the new Nazi German Reich from any opposition. Reports indicate that as many as 50,000 political dissidents are now incarcerated. The suppression of our German colleagues of the press also continued. While Goebbels squeezed media under more and more control, the press itself played a vital role in its own submission through a process of self-coordination, Selbstgleichschaltung. Renowned middle-class and conservative newspapers such as the Frankfurter Zeitung have now demonstrated their agreement with Hitler's appointment or asked their readers to give him a chance. Publishers acting out of opportunistic self-preservation are replacing unacceptable staff members with Nazi loyalists before they even have been ordered to do so. Throughout this quarter, approximately 2,000 journalists were purged for political or racial reasons. The daily press conference in the propaganda ministry has become the central institution of control, where journalists are given word-of-the-day directives that dictate every headline and editorial. News is no longer about facts, but about instructing the nation in the National Socialist spirit. While economic development looks to be about the same as before, the regime's battle for work, Arbeitsschlacht, announced last quarter, was launched in April, investing heavily in public works, ostensibly to lower unemployment, much like the plans now emerging from the White House in the US. However, this reporter has it from secure sources that the main goal is German military rearmament and expansion. A more efficient and effective way to lower unemployment numbers fast has now been devised: the systematic exclusion of women from the workforce. For instance, in June, the regime introduced marriage loans, vouchers for newlyweds granted on the condition that the woman gives up her job and remains at home. Such reforms will potentially remove hundreds of thousands of women from the labor market and the unemployment registers simultaneously. With this whirlwind of action, the Nazi Party is reportedly in an elated state of satisfaction. Add to their domestic advances a concerted effort by Goebbels to convince the world that the Nazis aren't as bad as everyone says. While receiving a seemingly endless flow of international representatives in Berlin, he stated already in April that they all come here loaded to the top with objections. Most of them go away converted. It is a great mistake on the part of the Jews that they lie so shamelessly to the world about us. In the long run, they cannot prevent foreign countries from coming into contact with us, and then the reaction in our favor will be all the stronger. He crowned his diplomatic efforts with a trip to Italy in June to improve relations with fascist leader Mussolini. But the Nazis suffered an international setback at the London Economic Conference, where leaders from across the world came together to look for ways out of the Great Depression. There, Alfred Hugenberg, a Reich Minister of Economics, one of the non-Nazi members of Hitler's cabinet, spilled the beans on the secret plans for renewed German colonial expansion in Eastern Europe and Africa, which created an international uproar and cost Hugenberg his post. There are also reports of internal tensions as the old guard of Nazis jostle for lucrative government posts, and the SA leadership, led by Ernst Röhm, are still clamoring for a second revolution to fulfill the movement's radical social promises so publicly abandoned in this quarter. The sentiment among ordinary Germans has ranged from ice-cold shock to jubilant euphoria. Hatanatov, a Jewish physician, recorded the effects of the boycott day when patients began abandoning their practice, most without explanation, some stating fears to be targeted if they continued to see a Jewish doctor, and a few even expressing sudden, open anti-Semitism. But the sentiment that seems to best describe the average German is that of Wilhelm Scheidler, a young worker and social democratic functionary who noted in May that "Our folk is unified. That is the greatest and most beautiful joy. May it only also become free. I am pleased that the National Socialists won so big. I welcome the result in the interests of Germany." After Boycott Day, our conservative housewife in Hamburg, Luise Solmetz, expressed a more complex side of German opinion. The excesses against the Jewish population on Boycott Day led her to state that this was simply not part of the national uprising, adding, "Our entire soul was bent on the German ascendancy, not on this." Yet she remained supportive of the Hitler regime. Things got even more complicated in late May when her 13-year-old daughter came home from school with a newly introduced obligatory school form to document pure Aryan ancestry. To her great surprise, Luisa now learned that her late parents-in-law had been non-practicing Jews and that her war veteran husband, Friedrich, had converted to Protestantism before they met. She tells us that it was never an issue that came up, writing that "Friede and I know each other for 20 and a half years. As strange as it seems, never has this been discussed between us with a single word." In the views of the Nazis, this makes Friedrich a Jew and their daughter a Mischling of mixed race. Friedrich defeatedly concluded that for their daughter, all paths, all doors are hopelessly closed and that they are now without a homeland. Despite this personal blow, Luisa remains steadfast that she is supportive of a German ascendancy, just without the anti-Semitism. The success of the Nazi takeover is so far not the effect of a chaotic collapse of democracy. It's the result of a coordinated effort by the Nazis they have been planning for years and are calling Gleichschaltung, roughly meaning synchronization, a process to bring the entire German federal system into line with the Nazi party agenda. The plan was devised under leadership of now disgraced top Nazi Gregor Strasser with Hitler's explicit approval. In January 1928, Strasser was named Reichsorganisationsleiter, leader of the party's Reich organization, and began creating the foundation for a swift and complete takeover of both federal and state-level government on all levels through propaganda, manipulation, bureaucracy, and administrative manpower, so that all autonomous institutions, from state parliaments to courts of law to press rooms to ministries to labor unions, can be systematically synchronized with the Nazi party, cut down or abolished. To achieve this plan, Strasser had divided the party into two political organizations, PO1 and 2. PO1, designed to undermine the government and run electioneering, sprang into full action well before 1933 and has now carried Hitler to power. PO2 was designed as a kraken hiding under the surface to establish a state within the state, with party departments mirroring the Reich government and institutions including departments of agriculture, justice, national economy, and the interior. Beginning in April, under the leadership of Strasser's successor, Robert Ley, this massive part of the NSDAP began to envelop its tentacles around all aspects of German public life to start squeezing out any remainders of the Weimar legacy. The plan is based on fascist ideological corporatism, making way for special economic and social interest groups to compete and thrive in a deliberate, organized chaos. monitored for ideological coherence with the Nazi dream to forge an imagined racially pure empire. While Gleichschaltung is carried out, they mean to cleanse any racially and ideologically undesirable civil servants and functionaries and eliminate any governing or legal principles that the Nazis label Marxist, democratic, weak, or Jewish. It creates a multi-dimensional dog-eat-dog hierarchy where even the top Nazi level functions as a court of princes set upon each other to outdo the next man in fulfilling the Führer's vision, even without his practical involvement. While the Soviets rose up during the Russian Revolution in 1917 and like a great big shark violently engulfed Imperial Russia, Nazism seems more like a parasitic fungus whose spores are now let loose into the existing German Reich system, weakened and tired by years of strife and political violence, in no little part orchestrated by the Nazi OP1. Once set loose, it means to grow and reproduce until the entire nation is part of the same mycelial network. The Nazi takeover is designed not to disrupt the economy any further or bring the nation to an administrative halt. Instead, the fungus lets its host function just as before with some significant restrictions. In fact, as it spreads, it exudes a powerful cocktail of propaganda, lies, and distortions that makes the host organism feel better than before and ever ready to continue feeding the infection, blissfully ignorant that this might ultimately kill both host and fungus. In essence, the German Reich federal structure is being left in place, but with its integrity destroyed and true power handed off to thousands of eager lesser and greater Nazi officials, hell-bent on purging Germany of her imagined enemies and restoring her perceived past greatness at home and abroad. Hitler has already told us the goal in his book, Mein Kampf: prime the nation for racial war of conquest and genocide. Never forget. I shall return in a week with the next developments in the German Reich, now the Nazi Reich. For some of my broader thoughts on all this and replies to some of your comments under these videos, follow my personal YouTube account right here. Also join the Time Ghost Army so that we can keep on fighting the good fight for history that can help us better understand the world around us and together forge a better future.